Welcome, welcome, welcome to everyone watching from wherever in the world you may be. My name is Kopano Tuyana Maruja, and I am a performance artist, writer, and culture worker, currently working here at Kunstenzentrum Voret as a curator and dramaturg. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this very special lecture with Silvia Federici, Rethinking and Restructuring Social Reproduction in Times of Racist Violence and Global Epidemics. As a global collective, we are living through some of the most transformational and difficult times in recent history. The impact of COVID-19 on our daily realities has brought into even sharper relief the gaps, destruction, and inequalities we have fostered here on our little blue planet. And in these times of great upheaval, we look to our elders, our artists, and our loved ones for guidance, inspiration, and support in the hopes of being re-enchanted with the world we share. The Now Worries Festival that this lecture was originally meant to form a part of was a gesture towards providing exactly this type of guidance, inspiration, and support. However, as is par for the course in the times we are living in, stricter COVID-19 regulations across society in Belgium have disallowed us from continuing as planned. Yet, here we are in this new form of togetherness. So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be with us from far but oh so close tonight. The Now Worries Festival was conceived of consisting of three pillars of solidarity. Solidarity between Gentian cultural centers, Kunstenzentrum Voret, NT Gent, Koppigieterij, SMAK, Opera Ballet Vlaanderen, and Campo. Solidarity between artists in a stage of emergence and development from these cultural centers, and solidarity from the Gentian cultural sector and broader society. If you'd like to find out more about the festival that never was and the situation for artists in these times, I would like to invite you to read the open letter of one of the featured artists, Mohamed Toukabri, that you will be able to find on the landing page of the Voret website. And if you are wanting to contribute to the support of artists and cultural workers facing precarity, I would like to invite you to check out the SOS Relief, an initiative of State of the Arts. Via SOS Relief, you can donate directly to someone in need or receive support, no strings attached. This tool facilitates person-to-person financial solidarity. It connects people with financial stability to people facing precarity as a result of the COVID-19 crisis in Belgium. Their website is stateofthearts.net. This lecture is part of a series of joyfully militant events on re-enchanting the world with Silvia Federici, including a film screening, a public debate, and workshop co-organized by Ghent University, Kunsthal Gent, and Voret. The public lecture is sponsored by the Ghent University Doctoral School's Hot Topic Lecture Series and is co-organized by the Department of Conflict and Development Studies, the Center for Research on Culture and Gender, and the Center for Global Studies at Ghent University. The Research Center for Gender, Diversity and Intersectionality at Vrije Universiteit Brussels and KU Leuven. Special mention must be extended to Dr. Sigrid Vertommen and Julie Gallière, who are the chief coordinators behind this public lecture and the Re-Enchanting the World with Silvia Federici series. So tonight we are going to be graced with a lecture by Silvia Federici for between 45 to 60 minutes. Following that, we'll have a panel discussion with Benedict Zitouni and Wana Oyarian, which will last for about 40 to 45 minutes. After that, we will have a Q&A of about 15 minutes. And those questions you can pop right in the Vimeo chat function that you should be able to see in your screen. Please include your name in your question and specify if your question is directed towards one of the speakers specifically. Our behind-the-scenes team will be making a selection from these questions, so we'll have time for about 2, 3, maybe 4 questions at the end of this conversation. And finally, it gives me great joy to introduce Silvia Federici, a longtime feminist activist and teacher. In 1972, she was among the founders of the International Feminist Collective, the organization that launched the campaign for wages for housework in the US and abroad. She has also been active in the anti-globalization movement and the anti-death penalty movement. Silvia Federici was a founding member of the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa. which for more than 10 years documented the struggle of African students against the austerity programs imposed by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank on African countries. She has taught in the United States and in Nigeria, and is an emerita professor of political philosophy and international studies at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. Federici is the author of many books and essays on political philosophy, feminist theory, cultural studies, and education. Thank you so much. I want to give the word over to Silvia Federici.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you to the University of Ghent and all those who have organized this event and who have invited me here. I'm very sorry that I cannot be personally present in Ghent, a town that I've long wanted to visit because it has played a role in my historical work when I was retracing the history of medieval popular revolts. Ghent stood out because in the 15th century, it was the site of a briefly short-lived workers' democracy, takeover by, so I've always wanted to, but I'm very glad to connect with all of you. And yes, despite everything, you know, this is one way to break out of the confinement, of the isolation, you know, in which we have been forced by this epidemic. And I want to say, first of all, a few things about what we have learned, you know, in the 3-4 months that we have been in this sort of lockdown. And first of all, we have learned that COVID is not a health crisis only. It's, first of all, is a political crisis. It has been clearly a political crisis because what we have seen in different ways across the world is that the disaster that this epidemic has caused, the mortality and the pain and suffering to really now practically almost millions of people, you know, is the result of a long process, you know, of disinvestment at the highest level of government, of the states, in the reproduction of our life, you know, in the reproduction of the social services, the infrastructures that we need, you know, in order to be able to prosper, in order to be able to live, from healthcare to agriculture, you know, every sphere of life that is important to our reproduction, to our body, to our health, to our social relations, you know, has been for a long time a disaster area. And here I could give so many statistics, but I will only say a few things. First of all, the almost global dismantling of medical infrastructure and medical programs. You know, in the United States, as one example, in New York, which prides itself, you know, calls itself the capital of the world, over the last 20 years, since 2000, 20 hospitals mostly catering for low-income people have been shut down, so that it has become more and more difficult for people to find a place to turn to when they have, unless they have resources and they can afford a clinic. Secondly, the destruction, undermining of our immunity system due to the poor alimentation and the continuous contamination of the air. So COVID is the result also of an ecological crisis, a political crisis in terms of the allocation of resources, and an ecological crisis very connected with it. For example, using again New York it's clear that the areas where the mortality has been the highest have been exactly the areas where the air is most contaminated. Areas that for years and years have seen an abnormal number of people with asthma. We also know that this is a global statistics. In China, there are many countries and towns in which people do not see any longer, the blue sky, where the sky is perennially covered, by dust, is perennially covered by poison that destroy our lung, and our existence. So, and of course, the contamination of the air, of course, the industrialization of agriculture, which basically makes sure that particularly for those who have low resources, the food that we eat is food that does not nourishes us and many times destroys us. And here there is much to be said about the fact that every day, and I imagine it's the same in Belgium, we are given the statistic of the people are dying of COVID, but we should also be given the statistic of people that are dying of cancer and are dying of all kinds of preventable diseases that are directly connected with the decontamination of the environment. Also, and centrally perhaps, we have learned that the epidemics is also most lethal because of the social injustices. The majority of people who have died in the United States have been Black and brown people. And in fact, now people say that a pre-existing condition, we hear a lot about pre-existing condition. Pre-existing condition is racism. Racism is a fundamental pre-existing condition because the fact that institutionally, every structure, every area of society discriminates, against the large population, discriminates against Black and brown people, if it is about housing, if it is about healthcare, if it is about community in which there is no access to decent food, and so on. And the racism itself destroys your system, destroys your immunities. We are learning that even Black people who have a certain level of income have a life expectancy much lower than white people, because the constant anxiety, the continuous expectation of a confrontation with the state, that discriminates against you, has an effect, on your system, has an effect on your psychology, has an effect on your body. So this is very important for us to understand. And first of all, let me say also that in addition to Black and brown people, the other population most affected have been women and the elderly. And we have seen a very spike of mortality in elderly people, particularly those living in nursing homes subsidized from the state. And here again, these are deaths that were announced. These are deaths that were predictable because all subsidized nursing homes have been systematically defunded. And already, and this applies to every aspect of COVID. In a way, COVID has opened a window and shown us, right, most clearly crises that were already there. It has shown us crises. It has not created a crisis. It has accentuated them. It has exploded them, but it has not created them. Because in all the circumstances that I have quoted, that I have mentioned, the crisis was already there. And of course, I want to particularly place the accent on the fact that one population that has been especially affected has been women. Women now, and this is a very, women are now the ones who are, in a sense, in the firing zone as far as the consequences of the epidemic. They are those who are considered or quoted, discovered as the essential workers in the hospital, the ones who every day have to go out as nurses, risking their life. And they are also the ones now who are most essential to the continuation of the community. And here, they are suffering. We see a crisis that was already there. The fact that millions of women have had now for many years to carry on two roles, two types of work, two work shifts, one outside the home and one in the home. Working outside the home has never reduced the amount of housework the women expected to do. And now that situation has become particularly explosive, both because so many have to go out of the home and risk really contamination, risk infection, risk death. And so the contradiction between their role as wage workers, risking death every day, and then coming home and have to face the situation with the families. And at the same time, those whose work has been transferred into the home. And now they are living in an impossible situation. So many women now are at home, having to do the housework, having to do the work outside the home, Zooming with the boss, Zooming with an office, etc., helping the children who are also at home, helping the children who now are having crises because of the confinement, helping the children with their work, and helping them to manage the internet, not to mention those who are dealing with children who may have chronic diseases or chronic problems. So I think we really need to look at this as a whole to understand, the fact that we live in a social system that does not reproduce our life, that we live in a social system that does not guarantee the reproduction of our life, that the epidemic, first of all, was predictable. COVID is receiving a lot of attention because now many of the people who are dying in Europe or are dying in the United States or in Israel. But in fact, there have been epidemics, particularly since the late 1970s, with the inception of neoliberal capitalism, right, which has practically taken the state investment in reproduction as completely or almost completely dismantled it. We have seen across Africa, across Latin America, a continuum of epidemics: meningitis, cholera, Ebola, dengue fever, avian flu. These, and I could mention others. So COVID was predictable. SARS, COVID was absolutely predictable. And nevertheless, very little was done. And now we see openly the consequences. And I should add, and it's not an irrelevant addition, this great surge of violence against women. Since the beginning of COVID, and these are statistics that are coming from every corner of the world, a 40% increase of violence against women. And we know also an increase in violence against children. Violence related, of course, to patriarchy, to unequal relation, to the fact that women are dependent on men, to the fact that women to this day, even working in the home, out of the home, don't have the money if they don't want to live with a man that is potentially violent. They cannot afford a rent of their own. And so they are dependent economically. All this escalated by the confinement, escalated by the economic crisis. So many people have lost their job. The future is uncertain. So the picture that I'm portraying, I portray this picture which we are all confronting. We are all confronting, and it's an international picture, even though, of course, with variation, depending on the context. Because I think that when we speak of restructuring, when we speak of where we go, what to do, we really have to think of a systemic change. We have to think of a systemic change. It's very important what is happening now. We have seen a lot of pain, suffering, but also a lot of generosity. You know, a mutual aid network have basically come up, you know, across the country, and I know across the world. People have collected food. People have organized means of transport to go into the houses of those who could, etc. All this is very important. Nevertheless, we need to go beyond emergency. We need to think of the change, structural changes, and the creation of infrastructure that enable us to really build a different social system. I think fundamentally, when we think of reproduction in times of COVID, we think, first of all, of the necessity to change the logic, the principle that governs reproduction in our time. Today, we live in a state internationally where the logic is completely perverse. If you produce armaments, if you produce means to kill people, you are a productive worker. Your work is considered part of the production of the social wealth. If you're raising children, it is not. You're not entitled to any form of remuneration, compensation. At best, you may have it indirectly through a husband if you have a husband. So, first of all, we need to change the logic. But this, of course, it's a large, long time project, because this is a system of basically domination of the world and exploitation of the world wealth. So we also need to begin to restructure, you know, our day-to-day life in such a way that not only we can provide, you know, more properly for the need that we have, the immediate need of our existence, but we also begin to create a different type of social fabric, a type of social fabric that strengthens the ties that we have with each other, that strengthens our solidarity, that breaks down the ways in which we have been isolated, which in fact, you know, debilitates our struggle. You know, the organization of our reproduction is an organization that fragments, you know, our existences, fragments our struggle. The house, the family, you know, forces each person, man or women, to confront the crisis that we meet every day, you know, in an isolated fashion. You know, so this is why, for example, so many women have looked at working outside the home as the path to emancipation, with the idea of escaping the isolation of the home. But I think we cannot abandon, in fact, reproduction as a terrain of struggle. Quite the contrary, quite the contrary. I think that one of the mistakes and the weaknesses of social movements in the past, particularly movements of the left, has been this separation between what was considered a political engagement and the reproduction of daily life. That so many times political engagement left the sphere of family, home relation completely untouched. And of course, because of the sexual division of labor, that politics has been a masculine enterprise, and at home were the women who prepared the food for when he came home from the demonstration. And this has been I'm now exaggerating because that kind of model has not been dominant for quite some time, but this has also been a trend, very, very important. We need to politicize our reproduction. We need to politicize our reproduction. Clearly, having a systemic change, bringing about a systemic change, it's a process that implies engagement on many, many levels. One engagement certainly is the construction of movements that recognize their common interest, right? So the construction of broad networks of movements, whether it is movements over health, over housing, over the environment, etc. We see the power of such coalition as exemplified, for instance, the other day in Chile, the incredible victory, the great success, of the referendum that put an end to the constitution that was implemented under Pinochet, the terrible, terrible constitution that was implemented, at the time of the coup in Chile. And this has been the product of a long process of movement coming together, joining their forces, seeing the continuity. And when we look at this from the point of view of transforming the system, and with in mind the going beyond, a world beyond epidemics, a world beyond capitalism, a world beyond the logic that governs today's society, right? We see that there is the task is seeing that all these struggles are continuous. You cannot have, for example, a successful struggle over health if many, many people are sleeping in the streets. We are told about social distancing and washing our hands, and half of the world does not have access to running water. So the hypocrisy of the system is unspeakable. No? So we see that the movement in the reality, in the material connection, those movements are already unified. And the necessity to create broad coalition, network of movement who organizationally are capable of coming together and supporting each other. This is one level. And the ability to see, right, that ecology, housing, health are not separate issues. They are one issue. Although each of us may be engaged, in the places where we can give our best contribution. But the other side, and of course they are connected, is the question of changing the everyday organization of our reproduction, what I call politicizing our reproduction, showing that unless we change the way we live, the way we relate to each other on a day-to-day basis, we cannot even give strength to this other broad process that I was describing of the networking of movements. People engagement in movement, people engagement in protest, in the capacity to construct something new is directly related to the way their daily life is organized. I'm thinking, for example, of the millions of women who are imprisoned in their home by lack of money, by the fact that they have to care for people, children or the elderly, and they don't have any time left, any energy left to, for example, go to a meeting. I'm thinking of all the people who have 2 jobs and they have to run. And this is the situation of so many women and so many people today. And this means that how our life is organized has a direct impact on the capacity on the capacity for our political participation. But there's also something else. And reconstructing, changing, the way we reproduce our day-to-day life, it's also a process that not only enables us to combine, put together our resources, and therefore, enable us to stretch our possibilities and enable many who might not be able to survive to also survive, right? But also enables us to begin from the present, starting from the present, to construct the elements of the society that we want to build. Begins to actually engage in a process of positive reconstruction. We cannot only protest. There is a moment for the protest. There's a time for everything, they say. There's a time for the process to be out in the street and say no. And there is a time for the construction. And that construction takes place particularly when we speak of our everyday life, the relation with each other, how we eat, how we relate to the children, how we relate to the environment. We care for the environment or we do not. We care how we speak to our children, etc., etc. A vast area of activity which are so transformative and which have such profound effect on our life. They may decide whether we, go by day to day by popping some antidepressant pill, right? Some tranquilizer because we are always living with pain, or we face the day in which we confront the crisis with other people, in which as we struggle, we are also supported by others, and being together with others expands our imagination, give us a broader sense of our possibilities, give us more confidence in ourselves, circulates knowledges, and give us the sense that we can actually begin a process of self-government. I've lately been writing and speaking much about it, and I call this the politics of the commons, right? To me, this is the kind of communalism, which is not, the proposal, of, moving along in our life, relying only on ourselves. Obviously, we need to reclaim, recuperate the wealth that is now in the hands of, the state, the capitalist class, the corporation. There is a whole process of reappropriation, reclamation of wealth. For example, I think that the function of a women's movement or a social justice movement today is to force a rechanneling of the public wealth away from war, away from prison, towards our reproduction. In the United States, there is now a broad movement that is calling for the abolition of the police. It's calling for the abolition of the jails, and is saying, stop funding the police, use those funds to create the social services that eliminate the need for the police. No, the police is an instrument of war against the people. The problem that we have, we need the resources to deal with those problems. Many of the problems which the police is called to resolve are created by the lack of funding, are created by the poverty, the desperation, the dislocation that all of this is creating. So I'm using this because I want to expand it. Not only defund the police, but defund this system. In a way, we need to create a different kind of system. We need to create a system that, as women in Latin America say, places life at the center, prioritizes the well-being of people, prioritizes the prosperity of the community, of the population, instead of the accumulation. Because we see that otherwise the system is not sustainable, not for us, not for the environment. As I'm speaking, for the third month, California has been burning. California, entire towns have been destroyed by fire. It's apocalyptic. The fires now have expanded to 3 more states: Washington, Oregon, and Colorado. Colorado is going up on fire. We think that, technology has achieved mastery over nature. Not at all. Not at all. So I think it's extremely important that we begin a process that, in fact, has already demonstrated of having great potential. I've been inspired recently by the experience of women in many Latin American communities, where for several decades now, there's been a process very brutal, a process decided and managed, by agribusiness, international agency like in the Monetary Fund and so on, which has dislocated, pushed people away, indigenous community, rural community, forced them to leave. The land has been privatized and maybe planted with soya instead of food, or so contaminated the people cannot live on it, or it has been desertified. In Mexico, many people have to leave their land because there is no water. Even if they have the land, they cannot plant because the water is gone. So they go to the town, and instead, through collective work, they have created a new community. And in this community, they come out of a massive crisis. You see new forms of existence. You feel a kind of cooperation that to me is inspirational. I obviously do not propose that we transport a model that is organized in a favela in Buenos Aires and can be applied any part of the world. But what we see is that when there is no choice, no alternative, cooperation among people, the realization that our life depends on the life of others, the necessary interdependence between us and the environment, and us and the others in the community, is what can save us. And this is the principle that I think we should apply when we think of constructing a society and forms of reproduction beyond COVID, right? The forms it has taken have been very interesting. We have seen urban gardens. We have seen, for example, urban gardens that have given food to people who had no access to food, and but also have created new forms of sociality. The gardens have come for people, come together, talk, exchange knowledges. Together with the garden, many, particularly women, have rediscovered all the forms of healing, knowledges of herbs, etc. We have seen the public kitchens, right, where people cook together collectively once a week. The next day, another group will cook. And this liberates time for everybody. So I'm proposing that, particularly women have been in the forefront of this process. And I think that when we look forward to recreating our community, restructuring our reproduction, certainly women have a great knowledge. Not alone, but certainly women, we have a knowledge. We know a lot more than we think we know. We know a lot more. And it's a knowledge that is not very specialistic. It's a knowledge that is broad because it's directed, is always shaped by looking at what other people's needs. I don't want to romanticize, But the work of reproduction is a special type of work, different from building a car. There is a knowledge that comes from building a car. There are other knowledges that come from raising a child, from dealing with people who are sick, from having to cook and having to worry about if this food is going to nourish people or is going to poison them. So I'm advocating, and I'm not advocating it. This is already happening. Actually, I'm learning. I am expressing what I see a lot of women doing. It's not an advocation. It's really expressing what I already see a lot of women. There's incredible creativity that it's already taking place with relation to health, with relation to the raising of children, the production of knowledge, the recuperation of knowledge, and also the reconstruction of the history and the memory of the places in which we live. No, we need to reanimate the places in which we live. I imagine that in Ghent, this will be a humongous process because there's been so much history in those streets. Imagine, walking around and knowing, making the walls and the street speak, right? Connecting with those who came before us, who struggled before us, right? Whose voice have been forgotten or were suppressed. But now we are here. We are their eyes. We are their voices. We are carry on their struggle. And I think that is part of that reconstruction of reproduction that I'm talking about. It's part of that rebuilding of the social fabric, in a way that it's not isolating us, and in a way that reconstitutes, our vital relation with our bodies, with nature, including the world of animals, and with the history of liberation, with the history of hopes that people have had, And I think that there is now a very rich experience that we can tap into. And here I want to say a few words about the power, in recent times of women calling for an international strike, because of course, that has opened a debate, a very interesting debate. What is a women's strike, right? We cannot think of a strike in the way unions, have thought of a strike, because so often the life of other people depends on us, etc. So that call has helped to understand the differences, in the terrains of struggle. But what has been launched in that call has been a sense of what has been created, has been a sense of the commonality internationally of the problems that we are confronting. And it has been an opportunity for an international exchange, of knowledges, projects, connections, etc. And I look forward to the fact that this COVID, this pandemic, and the kind of restructuring that will be organized by these governments, by the state, by international capital, will not succeed, because we can already see the outlines of the restructuring that is being planned. Capitalism has learned to turn disasters into accumulation opportunities. We have seen it with hurricanes. Hurricanes destroys the parts of town that are not desirable. And so those parts of town will not be reconstructed or will be reconstructed for other people. And the original inhabitants will never be able to return. Already we see with COVID that many small businesses are being destroyed, and we can foresee an expansion of corporate power, of large-scale businesses, the nationwide networks of pharmacies, etc. We can see, from the point of view of women, we can see that there is an attempt to reinvest into the home, to basically push women back into the home and force them to take on much of the reproductive work. So if you can have a woman who has a paid job, maybe, and at the same time is at home, and so she can do much more of the housework, this is a great saving of money. It's a great saving of money. Capitalism really wants us both as underpaid wage worker and as house worker, unpaid, right? And maybe if we are at home, the children can help with our work. We know the history of homework is that slowly the whole family helps. No, the whole family helps. So there's clearly an attempt that it's really a major tendency in neoliberal capitalism to have the state move away from any support to our reproduction and have instead the family to take it over. And we cannot allow that to happen. We actually have to organize movements that move in the opposite direction, in the direction, in fact, of rechanneling resources and not taking them away from our reproductive time. So this is the proposal that I see has to be embraced in whatever form, depending on the social context, because we cannot only operate on the basis of large movements in the streets, large protests from Belarus to New York, Oregon, Portland, Oregon, Ferguson. We have seen people go for the last 3 months. People in the United States have been in the street every day, and in many cases, every night, right? And we have seen that the display of violence, I'm not saying that this was not necessary. I'm not saying that this was useless, but we have seen that it is not enough. And I think the work in the community, the work in the politicization of our reproduction, the beginning of creating a much stronger social fabric and beginning to say revolution is not in the future. Revolution is now. Today we have begun to organize form of self-government, which means creating also social spaces in our community where we come together, where we reclaim our collective decision-making process. We reclaim the capacity, not only wealth, not only space, but the capacity to decide on what is most important in our life, reclaiming the collective decision-making capacity. So I think that this is what can bring us to a world beyond epidemic. When we look at it historically, we see that the moments of crisis are like the crossroads, right? They can be used against us, but they also give us the opportunity. The crisis says things cannot go on as before. And I think this has to be a very important moment of learning and an important moment of change. And I also believe the women and all non-conforming subjects have a crucial role to play here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Silvia, for those powerful, powerful words. I really want to highlight one of the things that you said. Revolution is not in the future, revolution is now. I really appreciate the urgency that you're calling for in this moment,
Yes.
or that you're recognizing in the world today as we see what is happening today in Lagos, in Nigeria, with the End SARS
Yes,
movement and trying to end police brutality
absolutely.
there. Looking at the Black Lives Matter movement in North America with the murder of George Floyd, and looking
Yes,
at what's happening all across the world at the moment, like you mentioned, the Chilean referendum. This is a moment of urgency, and we are witnessing in our lifetime revolution, and I want to really thank you for highlighting that. I'd
yeah.
like to take this moment to introduce our panelists, our two guest speakers, Benedict Zituni and Juana Uyorian. Benedict Zituni is a lecturer in sociology and the head of the Center for Sociological Intervention and Research at the University of Saint-Louis in Brussels. She's part of the Group of Constructive Studies at the University of Brussels and of the Archive Committee at the Center for Animation and Research on Political Ecology. Zituni has been the co-author of books on urban planning, land transformation, and conflict. She wrote the foreword to Alice Cook and Gwyn Kirk's recent translation of Greenham Woman Everywhere, and has written herself on themes such as ecofeminism and feminist commitments in academia. Juana Uyorian is a Brussels-based writer, activist, and researcher. In her art and praxis, she explores the revolutionary potential of fictional and existing care ecosystems, trying to bring them together. She raises children and helps organize the International Women's Strike. Hello, hello, Benedict and Juana. I want to ask you guys quickly to say a little bit about where in the world you are at the moment and how you're doing today. Benedict, if you'd like to start.
Well, right now, hello everyone. Thank you for your nice speech. But right now, so I'm in Brussels, which I'm an inhabitant for the last 40 years, let's say. So I'm a Brussels-based and raised and born woman now. And your second question was just
Was just in general, how are you doing today?
to be online. Oh, just in general?
In general, yeah.
So in general, quite happy to be able to talk things through about the pandemic. I think it's actually the first time I do this in a lecture, and that we can, from a feminist point of view, talk this through. But so quite happy to be able to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you, Benedict. Juana, the same question. Can you share with us where in the world you are at the moment and how you're doing today?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Copano. Thank you, Silvia, for a very interesting talk. And I'd like to thank my comrades who invited me and Vooruit for hosting us. I'm in Brussels right now. I'm originally Romanian, but I've lived here for more than 15 years. And in general, how I am, how we all are probably feeling quite claustrophobic. And I have to say I'm a lot more skeptical and less enchanted about the current moment than maybe Silvia is trying to inspire us to be. But I'm happy to leave this talk more optimistic.
Little critical generosity might be in order. Thank you so much for that, Juana. I want to remind our viewers that are viewing from Vimeo, if you have any questions, please don't forget to pop them in the Vimeo chat function so that our behind-the-scenes team can extract them and share them with me. We have a few minutes at the end of this talk for a Q&A, and what a fantastic moment to be able to ask your questions to Silvia, Juana, Benedict live and in color. So please don't forget, put your questions in the Vimeo chat function. Please do share with us what your name is, and if you have a particular question that is directed to one of our speakers, please do indicate that as well. I'd like to start with a question towards Benedict. In a recent interview with Mo Magazine, you said the following: sexism, racism, extractivism, they all have the same origins in early modern thinking. And so the fight against all those forms of oppressions is linked. And you continue, for feminists, a life-supporting economy means investing in all healthcare sectors, in the development of our creativity, our physical development, and our culture. So we're seeing the ways in which COVID-19 is undermining the possibility of collective investment in these systems that you mention. And I wonder, from your perspective as someone who's coming from ecofeminism and an intersectional practice, how do you see, in practical terms, how do you think we can link the destruction of the intersectional nature of oppression with the creation of a life-supporting economy? Simply put, how do we destroy and create at the same time?
And so what should be destroyed? So can you just say that again?
Yes, so how do we dismantle and destroy the intersectional nature or the intersectional oppressions and the systems that foster those intersectional oppressions on society, while creating and developing life-supporting economy, investing in healthcare sectors, developing our creativity and our physical development and our culture?
Okay. I think I'll take over one of the gestures that Silvia has already put to the fore when she said, I'm not advocating and it's already going on. I think the same is true for destruction, dismantling happening at the same time that the building of life-supporting economics is still going on at the same time. What I mean to say in a very concrete way, I think we can only say that there are common roots between patriarchy, extractivism, racism, in 5 century long historical common roots, and that it has been going on for 5 centuries. We can only say that and have some faith that this can change because in the interstices of that machine or of that system, resistance continued. Resistance continued, just like Silvia said. If we could just foster the memory of all the struggles that have been going on in our own streets, but what we've forgotten about, the People's Revolt, the short-lived experiences, there would already be a sense that, in fact, this, the dismantling, that's why I was asking, is it destroying, or is it already building inside the interstices, or building as in opposition against a system that is at the winning hand? So, rather than advocating, it would be to relaying these experiences and the commoning experiences that are going on and that have actually never stopped. When you hear anthropologists talking about the ways in which some of the practices or agricultural practices have never been forgotten in some of the places in Latin America, you think, what kind of the rebellion or the revolution is now has been actually practiced by quite a few minorities throughout these centuries. And I think we can only actually pose this diagnosis of these 5 centuries long domination because there always has been counter voices. So if we then talk very concretely of self-supporting economics, I was going in the same direction as what has already been said, healthcare, the urban gardens, the urban kitchens, even our institutions. How can you foster institutions inside, how can you foster solidarity inside academia, inside university, turn it back into places where we actually, sit down with students and say, let's learn together. Let's turn this whole machinery of evaluation into something a little bit different. So it's everywhere where we are, as with the knowledges we have as women, as has been rightly said, the work of reproduction is maybe a little bit different than putting together a car. Well, all of that knowledge, we can also bring it back into our institutions and try something else, and we're never alone. There are always a few other women who are also trying to do similar things. So if I can give a really short answer, it would be opening our eyes to the fact that it has been going on for centuries, and that we can continue that work and hope, in a way, what I hope, if there is some hope in this whole story, is that the system is losing its legitimacy completely. And that is maybe, it can go both ways. Huh? It doesn't say that because the system has is losing legitimacy that it will be turned over. It can turn into something much worse even. But it's losing legitimacy in ways that are going much faster than I thought they would. So that would be for the destroying and building up question.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that multi-layered answer to what was actually quite a multi-layered question. I really appreciate what you foreground there in foregrounding that nothing is unprecedented and that we come from a long lineage of different modes and histories of resistance against oppression, and we are currently seeing the recapitulation of a long history and a long story, and that the work, I suppose, for those of us who are invested in struggle is to go back and find the inspiration from those struggles and to ask ourselves how to bring that energy and bring those insights into our current situation, because the struggle continues, but we are not coming, or we're not starting from zero. So thank you for foregrounding that and highlighting that. My next question, I want to pivot to Juana. Juana, I'm wondering, as someone who is interested in fictional domains and fictional ideas around fictional care ecosystems. There is a quote by a Black American futurist by the name of Adrienne Maree Brown. And Adrienne Maree Brown has written a book called Emergent Strategy. And in Emergent Strategy, she writes, imagination is one of the spoils of colonization, which in many ways is claiming who gets to imagine the future for a given geography. And I wonder, within your practice and within your art, what do you see as being possible in the way of the role of fiction in reclaiming our imaginations from the limitations of oppressive systems?
Well, it's a great quote because it also applies to the past as much as it applies to the future. So it's always the oppressors who get to write the past, and they get to write to dictate the future. But I'm coming from a materialist tradition, so I don't think, even though I'm an artist, I don't think art or ideas are the ones that drive change, but they sort of come in the footsteps of the change in material conditions. So in that sense, what we are able to imagine is strictly based on the things that are actually happening to us in the real world, let's say. Even if we project it into the future, it's very much conditioned by the actual real material conditions that are oppressing us, or in which we are oppressors, because we often see art being used as a tool of social reproduction, of reproducing privileges, of reproducing oppressions. In my personal creations, in my personal writings, I focus on class struggle and on how class struggle is always a separate social reproduction struggle, because it's always basically for better lives, in other words. And conversely, how social reproduction always maps onto the class struggle, because if you are poor, your social reproduction is more at risk than if you're not poor. So in that sense, art and imagination comes in the footsteps of how our lives are conditioned by what's happening around us.
Mm-hmm. And so, in that way, do you feel that the kind of the byproduct or the natural extension of our lives is then the art that we produce, which is potentially a reflection, not of necessarily a way out, but just a sincere reflection of what our conditions are and potentially where it is that we would like to go, or what it is, the ways in which we would like to live?
We can imagine ways out, but again, they are conditioned by what we have to get out of, in that sense. So especially in a world where there are gatekeepers and there are struggles going on in the art world as well for finding your own niche, what is being heard and what we can put out there, because we make art for an audience, we don't make art for ourselves. It's a collective effort. It's an effort aimed at a collective that receives it, whether it's an audience or whether it's the whole world or whatever. Yes, so it can imagine the future, but it has to talk to the present, to the actual thing that is surrounding us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that, Wanda. My next question, and before I go to the next question, I also want to invite all the panelists, if something is coming up for you, if there's some a question that you'd like to pose to one of the other panelists or clarification that maybe you'd like from something that one of the other panelists has said, please feel free to jump in and let me know if you'd like to ask that question. But my next question goes to Silvia. In speaking about all the multi-layered and multiple struggles that we are facing as a kind of global community, society, however we want to think about ourselves, the question of endurance comes up for me. How is it that we can endure these long-standing struggles, like Benedict pointed out, like you pointed out, Silvia? We come from lineages of long-term struggle that we are still fighting in the present day, that come from hundreds of years back. How do you imagine we can foster the endurance to continue to pick up the mantle that has been placed on us, passed on to us by our ancestors?
Yeah, well, first of all, we do not always endure. Communities are being destroyed. People are being destroyed. We see, for example, in the United States, the destruction of human life is all around us. It's not even invisible. It's, you go in the street, and now, for instance, because of the COVID, many people have not been able to pay rent. They lost their job, they cannot pay rent, and now they sleep in the street. They sleep in the parks. You see, and they foresee 40 million people now in danger of losing their homes. Imagine, this is now, and we're talking about New York, we're talking about United States. Not to mention what is happening, the people at the frontier, at the border with Mexico, who have been dying, who have been taken into detention centers, separated from their children. Last week, the figure of 50,000 children that the United States government has separated from their parents. They now don't know to whom they belong, because the parents, they were separated at the border. The parents were deported to Guatemala, Mexico, God knows. And now they have these children. Some of the children were reconnected, but they now have thousands and thousands. I say this, I think I want to say this to say that, I'm not speaking about Pollyanna, that everything is easy and good and the destruction, but because of it, the systemic change is more than ever necessary. Right? Now, the endurance comes precisely from the kind of reconstruction of the social fabric of the community that I'm speaking about. It comes from a kind of politics that not only goes to a demonstration one next to each other and you don't know the person next to you, but begins to create also affective ties in the day-to-day relationships that are built in the solving of the common problems of reproduction. In the solving of the common problems of reproduction, there is also a production of affectivity and a production of solidarity. This is what makes it possible for us to endure. This is what, this, by the way, is a role that in the past, often the family has been a very contradictory institution. It's an institution that have lived under the domination of capitalist relation, with enormous limits, with power relation built into it, between the wage earner, the wife, the children, At the same time, the family has also helped to protect, has also created relationship of care, of effective, at least at best, that has allowed people not to give up, has allowed people to regain some hope, some desire, some joy, some moment of joy. The relation between women and children, without wanting to romanticize, has been a great love affair. It's also been a great suffering. I don't, a great suffering. But I'm saying now, speaking from a political point of view, speaking from the point of view of building movement and politics of social change, I think that this engagement in the process of reproduction is also important from the point of view of creating the possibility for their endurance. I think that the crisis that we meet will be different if we meet them with other people, if we don't meet them alone. The desperation. Today, I know, again, I'm using the example of this day, but I think it's very emblematic because this is supposed to be a rich country. And yet, you have women women at the proletarian working class level are the biggest consumer of antidepressant. Millions and millions of antidepressants are consumed every day by women, is what allows them to go from one day to the next. An enormous amount of exhaustion, unhappiness, and being able to be with other people, to look at other people not as a threat, but as a support. I think this is what makes for the endurance. And when I mean other people, and I want to repeat it again, is not only the living, but also the dead. That's where the memory, in Mexico, women have told me that when they have gone, women have been involved in different struggles against extractivism, against dispossession. They told me that the communities, they had the strongest link with the past, the deepest consciousness of the struggles of the past were those who were more capable of resisting when a mining company came into the village, because they had, in a way, their memory created a collective subject, create a strong sense of a common interest and a sense of connectivity with something broader than people's lives, the people's individual life. He gave them courage. He gave them a place. They placed themselves historically, from the point of view of affective relation, in something that went beyond their individual lives and made them able to resist.
Thank you so much for that interconnected fabric that you wove for us in that answer. What I'm picking up from what you're saying is that one of the mechanisms, or one of the strongest mechanisms that we can use to develop our endurance is to lean into interdependence, to lean into relationality and communality, and to not only lean into interdependence with those who are with us and those who are present with us, but also those who are no longer with us. So interdependence with the living, but also interdependence with ancestors and interdependence with thinkers, makers, people who have struggled before us. I want to thank you for that point.
And with nature, and with the natural world.
Not to be forgotten.
Mexico women bury the placenta when a child is born. They bury the placenta into the ground. It's a big ceremonial, and it shows the continuity and the responsibility and the fact that we don't only take from the earth, but give, care for it. And so that relationship also with the natural world is very important.
Thank you for that nuance. I think that's a really important point to make. And on that point of of interdependence and communalities and collectivities and relationalities of care, I want to pivot back to Juana. The work that you are focused on and that you're doing is really looking at this idea of care ecosystems. I wonder, Juana, can you tell us a little bit more about how you have seen and potentially foresee the necessity for or the power of interdependence in these care ecosystems?
Yeah, now you can hear me. It's a complex question. As a mother, for example, I'm going to focus on this part. I'm thinking a lot about how we can rethink childcare, because the way it's set up in capitalism, and especially if you take it by class, it's a very traumatic experience, parenthood, because children are basically privatized. Basically, you are on your own. Most services have been defunded. Services that are supposed to support you, like for example schools. So everything that's left of schools is they're just kind of watchdogs that you are successfully transforming your child into a future capitalist subject, but they don't actually have the means anymore to intervene very much beyond that, or to help out actually. So I'm very, very interested in how we can rethink childcare, child rearing, and in general care. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's actually needed, and it's something that Silvia also alluded to, and I think Benedict as well. It's the sort of revolution that would actually recenter social reproduction as being the core of the society we live in, and production having just an annex role, a support role for the social reproduction of society. But this, because if we look at the child rearing, for example, there's a clear tendency towards collectivization, towards sharing all the time, except in capitalism, it's also commodified. So if you can afford a nanny, you're going to have a nanny. Some women have nannies, but some women are nannies. And it's always been like that as long as there are inequalities between people. So it's nice and easy to speak about collectivization, but we have to go even a step further back and look at who owns the means of production, and by extension the means of reproduction. And it's there that we have to go and really center the struggle, because as long as there are inequalities in this type of ownership, no matter how many urban gardens we're going to have, no matter how much community-based work we're going to do, there will still be huge differences between communities. For example, in Brussels, there are huge differences between communities simply because of the housing policy or the lack of housing policy. And it's the same in my hometown in Romania, in Cluj, where you have basically ghettos for the Roma people. No matter how much resistance they put up there, they will never be fully integrated and fully members with full rights in this collective community. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's very complex when we speak about collectivization or about collective care, collective systems. We have to really think to really go back to what's specific about capitalism, what's specific about the moment we live in, and really deconstruct it from there, because it's not enough to just resist locally and punctually.
Thank you so much for that sobering reminder, and to really localize us in the reality of class separation, and to really highlight that fact of the possibility of social reproduction is completely dependent on who it is that owns the means of production, and that before we can interrogate that point, we cannot even begin to really imagine what it would mean to center our social reproduction if we cannot answer to our accountability in the unequal dissemination of the means of production.
But also the means of reproduction. I think we have to look at them together, because housing, for example, is a means of reproduction that has been commodified. I think, for example, housing should be a right. It shouldn't be a commodity that some people can afford and some people cannot. You have unhoused people on the streets of Brussels, lots of children, as Silvia mentioned. How can you fight COVID when you have people who have to live out in the cold? And so it's important to make a distinction between the means of production and of reproduction, but also to question them and to deconstruct them and to distribute them equally together.
I would like to interject something, which is that I never, if you listen to my presentation, I began exactly saying that we need to operate simultaneously at two levels. And one is the level of broad social movement, the fight around housing, etc., and changing the logic of the system, which means changing the system, which means changing the organization of production and ownership. So that one, and I think this is the one that is more easily seen. It's not the more easily implemented, but everybody, what I wanted to accentuate when I spoke about the locality, in no way, if you listen to my presentation, I suggested that we can, acting locally through urban garden, et cetera, change the system. That has to happen together with the broad changing in the organization and in an anti-capitalist program. However, I insisted on the power from below, because we have had, I don't know how many of those struggles, housing struggle, et cetera, but the division, the isolation that happen within the community. I think that one of the difficulties in achieving some of the goals, the housing struggle and struggle over who controls the means of production, have also been because we have been divided, we have been isolated, because many times the kind of unity that one achieves on the streets in a movement is then undermined at the level of reproduction, is then undermined because we have divided the home, the family, familiar relation, the children, et cetera. So I've emphasized the restructuring because that kind of struggle is the one that perhaps is the most difficult to be seen, in the same ways as reproduction has been invisible as a place of political struggle and accumulation. So it has been invisible also as a terrain of struggle. But absolutely, it would be unimaginable that acting only locally, you can transform a system like a capitalist system. On the other hand, unless we also create a counterpower in the community. I mean, one of the problems that we meet today, for instance, is that with, after decades of working class struggle, you had working class communities that had a certain amount of power, solidarity built by, in the strikes, et cetera. All those communities have been dismantled by the industrial restructuring of the 80s and 90s. The kind of counterpower that the working class could count upon in negotiating with the state and capital, for instance, in the 60s and 70s, it's not available today. Those communities have been completely dismantled. There is a social fabric that I think has to be reconstructed.
Thank you so much for that interjection, Silvia. I want to bring Benedict into the fray. I wonder, Benedict, from your position as someone who is situating themselves at the intersection of ecofeminism, I wonder, from your perspective, how do you think we can acknowledge the violences, both micro and macro, we experience as people living under oppressive systems, while also taking accountability for the violences we may be complicit in? How can we possibly restructure the binary of perfect victim versus perfect survivor in the context of so many oppressive systems that we are both victim to and party to?
I come from also a political ecological background, and I think it's very important to say, if we are talking about the violence, we're coming from a long history of violence, and the ecological disaster is also an affective one, affective in the sense of affect, a psychological one. The fact that we are not raised anymore to be in solidarity, not raised to actually cultivate and foster interdependence and solidarity. So for me, this whole notion of counterpower is really incredibly important. Incredibly important in the sense that I acknowledge as one of the major disasters of capitalism, the fact that our brains and our imaginations are completely ruined. Not completely, otherwise we wouldn't be left here to talk, but that it's not so easy to counteract, not so easy to believe that community building or call it local, but local support systems could actually change anything. We're rather taught to believe or raised to believe that it won't change a thing. So if we go for the micro and macro, I'm happy to do that, and the systemic change and the local change, etc. But not to forget that we can also play the game of the enemy when we say it won't help anything because we're not doing anything systemic. Yes, but wait a minute, you know, how do you build a global movement? And it is absolutely possible. That's not what I'm saying. But I mean, there's a lot here that's being discussed together. And one of the things I would like to add to the conversation, because to me it's incredibly important, I think it's been lacking a little bit, although it's been coming up now in the conversation, is, you know, when we say nature is important, the natural element is important. But I think if nature is important, and if ecology is important, and the environment is important, the water, the air, and all the rest of it, and of course, much more than that, then we need to also pose a diagnosis or put the diagnosis in very different terms. We cannot continue to speak as we do as Marxists do. And I am also a Marxist, but I do think it needs to be, a layer needs to be added. We cannot continue to say that it's just all a matter of the social system and the social system that needs to change. There are at least two systems here colliding. It's a social, when we're talking about the COVID and the pandemic, it's a social system that is being weakened and destructured and transformed by capitalism. And so something that should be the vulnerability of living beings that humans are on this planet has become helplessness because the entire social fabric is being defunded. Okay, so that we understand. But that social system is grafted on, is coexisting with, needs to at least be fought with the web of life. The web of life, which is this planet. And I think that we should, if we start talking about the pandemic, we need to start with at least these two things. Interconnecting, one weakening the other, one unleashing the other. You know, you can say Gaia is a bitch. And the web of life here is doing things. The virus is doing things to us that, of course, the violence is unleashed of Gaia, if you can put it that way, because the social system has so little of a social fabric of solidarity and a social fabric that can actually withstand something that is part of living on this planet. Pandemic, viruses are part of who we are, of what this planet is. And so if I'm saying this as maybe, you know, an eco-feminist, is that I think that we cannot continue to say, oh, it's COVID or it's something else. No, maybe we need to start talking about this COVID. what has happened in the web of life, that these pandemics can get so ugly on us. And so the pandemic and the web of life is also interconnecting and interpenetrating with what we are calling the social system. So if we want systemic change, we need to think it with the web of life. And then, of course, it means that if you have memory, if you have endurance, it's endurance with the living, with the dead, with the people who will come, and also with all of the web of life that is surrounding us and that is actually not even just surrounding us, supporting us. If we are talking of life supporting economics, I mean, we cannot go next to the web of life. That's the basics. Those are the bases. So, so I'm just adding that layer because I think if we continue to just be inside, the social system, we're lacking a big part of what is going on right now, which is really also part of our helplessness, is that our vulnerability, which is our vulnerability as human beings on this planet, amongst other beings on this planet, we are vulnerable to start with, whatever happens. But we have the power to actually change other, solidarities, interdependencies, etc. And capitalism has made us helpless. Capitalism has made us weak. But you need to think that in interconnection with the web of life. And so, to me, that sort of changes the whole question of micro and micro, because a web of life, self-supporting economics, interdependence, although capitalism is a global system, but it is actually worked out and thought through in localities. So it is in places that you actually need to install and foster and cultivate, other ways of going about our relationship to these planetary, life systems, to these planetary reproductive systems. And when I say planetary, I should maybe say terrestrial, of planet Earth. Earthly would be maybe the right word, earthly webs. So, I mean, just saying, if we're talking macro, then we need to at least put in the macro level of, the earthly web of life. And if we do that, it brings in the locality as a major focus point, You cannot say that the earthly web is just the global planet. It's also this ecosystem, that biotope, that source, that water, that we need to care about. And that happens locally. That doesn't only happen on the global level.
Thank you, Benedict, for encouraging that level of specificity in the way that we have these conversations, not just in these kind of what can be easily broad sweeping statements and gestures, but really trying to localize or situate ourselves on a planet, and from that planet to localize ourselves even further with where on that planet we're situated and what then we can cultivate on a relational level with our specific locality. Really appreciate that, the clarification. I'd like to move now to the Q&A segment of our conversation. We've received a question from Monica for Silvia. The question is, we like your thoughts on an obviously necessary system change. We're wondering how you see the processes of going to a more interdependent, ecological, equal, and feminist society more concretely.
Now, can we take 2 or 3 questions maybe, or only one?
There are a few. I've got a few questions lined up here, so I can either present these questions to the entire panel and present a series of questions, and then we go from there. Yeah. Okay. So that's 2 or 3 questions in one go, and then we go for some answers. So first question, we like your thoughts on an obviously necessary system change. We're wondering how you see the processes of going to a more interdependent, ecological, equal, and feminist society more concretely. That is a question from Monica. Thank you for that question, Monica. Another question coming again from Silvia's provocations. You said there was a time for protest and no, and a time for reconstruction. However, in places where reconstruction is able to happen in the society we live in, there is a lack of representation. Black people, LGBTQ plus people, women, etc. Keeping this in mind, how do you see women's knowledge having an impact outside of protests and more into the place of reconstruction? This is a question from Babette. I'll state the question again. You said there was a time for protest and no, and a time for reconstruction. However, in places where reconstruction is able to happen in the society we live in, there is a lack of representation of Black people, of LGBTQ plus people, of women. Keeping this in mind, how do you see women's knowledge having an impact outside of protests and more into the place of reconstruction? Question from Babette. And it's worth noting that the way that Babette has spelt woman is with an X to indicate beyond cisgender woman. Mm-hmm. I think those are two very meaty questions. So I think I'm going to leave it at those two questions for now. And from any of the panelists, if there's anyone that would like to tackle one of those two questions or both.
Okay, I would say that the two questions are very connected. I almost see them as one question, and here again, I want to mention to things that are already, happening. For example, I mentioned before in my presentation that I've been very inspired by the struggle that I've seen by women in rural and urban areas, in Latin America. And I see, for example, that women have a major role in this process of reconstruction, and including in terms of recuperation and use of knowledge, traditional knowledge. For example, a simple example, in large part of the Caribbean island, Central America, and also Latin America, women have gone back to seed selection. They are creating seed banks. Seed selection, it's a very important process. Traditionally, it's a process that traditionally in the history of Latin American women have done, right? And it has an enormous impact. It has had an enormous impact on the history of agriculture. For instance, in Latin America, you have had the production of 200 types of potatoes, and 200 types of corn. And this is because of the careful seed selection. The traditional way, I'm taking too much time to talk about this, but I think it's a very good example of women's knowledge and relationship to the earth, right? So there's a difference, for example, in the way people, and particularly women, have been planting in Latin America and the way people have been sowing in Europe, which is the throwing of the seeds. Here, the selection of the seeds has actually created a much more, and we talk about science. This is science. And then it's something that women have done, right? Women who didn't have a degree. And they're doing now, they're recuperating their knowledge, not to be dependent on Monsanto, to control the genetic material, of what their family eat. Right? And there is a tremendous level of organizing that is taking place in localities in response to the advance of mining, petroleum drilling, the building of highways that destroy the forest. And the fact that women, and this is very important, the fact that women are the ones in charge of reproduction. They are the ones who have to cook. They are the ones who have to take care of the children. They are the ones who have to go and fetch the water and make sure the water is not contaminated, who have to deal with the diseases. The people has meant they are now the ones who in many cases are in the front line of the struggle with agribusiness, with those who are, taking over land to plant the plants for green gasoline, etc. They are defending the environment. They are defending the relation with nature. And I think this is very important. And in the process of making this struggle, they have also realized they have to be feminist, because in many cases, the power relation with men are such that they cannot make a struggle. That the power relation with men in the family or men that are brought in to do the mining, to do the deforestation, is such that they have to organize to defend themselves from men instead of fighting with the oil company. They've discovered that in order to be able to fight against the company that comes in to destroy their community, they also have to deal, with the men. So that the struggle over ecology and the struggle against patriarchy, it's one and the same struggle. So I've been in assemblies with women who had so much knowledge, and they were organizing so powerfully. There'll be a group of women that will be recuperating traditional knowledges about herbs, about medicinal plants. There was capitalism teaches us to devalue the past, to devalue the knowledge, to believe that only capitalism produced science, the great scientific revolution. No, there was a tremendous amount of knowledge. Before the European came to Latin America, there was a tremendously developed agricultural system that reveals, when I cannot go into detail because there's no time, in the way of planting, in the way of selecting seeds, in the way of adapting seeds to the different particularities of the environment. And people, women are recuperating that, as well as forming communal forms of reproduction, realizing that together they have more power, they gain more knowledge, their imagination expands. Juana has spoken about the impoverishment of our imagination, and Benedict too. That's right, we are being expropriated. And isolation makes you think that you have no powers. And one of the first effects of coming together is regaining the sense of possibilities. I don't know if I'm going enough into this. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate what you ended off with, regaining the sense of possibility. I think that's a really beautiful rallying cry for the moment that we find ourselves in. I wonder, Benedict, yes, you have something to offer.
I just want to add perhaps another a case or another example that I was just looking it up on my phone to have the exact name, and then I realized that it is all over the place. It's the Mothers Against Police Violence. The Mothers Against Police Violence here in Brussels. There's probably also in Flanders, in Wallonia, there must be groups as well. I've just seen them on a municipal level acting for the safety of their kids, and especially their sons and their teenage sons in the neighborhoods. And what I saw there in the ways that they would talk to the police, that they knew their law, that they were, that they were very knowledgeable of how it all works, was also this the force of community building or community knowledge of being in the community, as well as they were protesting, as well as they were trying to actually protect their children. They were also trying to foster community forces, and actually even saying to the police, which was an amazing moment, we want police, but not that kind of police. We want, some eye watching over our kids, but can it be can it not be community based? And I'm saying that because in one of the questions it was, time for protest and time for reconstruction. But very often when women go to the fore and act as keepers of or mothers for something, and that doesn't mean that they are necessarily mothers, but that they take up that role of the carer. Very often when they protest as carers and as mothers, they are actually protesting or activating, doing activist acting from the forces of reconstruction of that community building. So the two are connected in many cases, actually, and that's what can make us also a little bit hopeful about what is already going on. So in a way, if we're saying what concretely can be done, is maybe look into what is happening in our own municipalities and in our own even in Belgium. And so as I was looking on my phone, I realized there's also others. Walls of Mom. I mean, there's many mothers against police violence, and who are connecting the two between protest and the force of reconstructing a sort of a community force and putting that to the fore and not waiting to be represented. I think that's also very, very important to say we are not represented. Well, yeah, that's sort of the point. They do not want us to be represented. So maybe we need to go into the municipalities, and that's what I saw them doing. They actually asked to be heard by the mayor, and just sort of grab the representation, if you like.
Thank you for that practical and tangible example. I'm really left with what you said, kind of by the way, many mothers. That seems to be a really strong kind of like motif that's coming up in our conversation, many mothers. Juana, I don't know if you have anything to add from what Benedict was saying or to the question more generally.
I was going to follow up on her link between protest and reconstruction. Let's say I'm very inspired by what's happening now in Poland, the protests against the ban on abortions. I think the right to abortion is a way to collectively own the means of reproduction. I don't think it's an individual thing. I think it's a way to allow women or people with the uteri to take control collectively of reproductive possibilities. And I'm thinking that, for example, in my country, in Romania, abortion is legal. It's freely available, but you have quite a high percentage of doctors who are refusing to perform them on conscientious objection grounds. Now we can argue whether that's even acceptable to conscientiously object to providing healthcare. But the fact that only medical doctors with a medical degree are allowed to perform abortions is a way of excluding, for example, midwives with their wealth of knowledge from providing a service that is very easy to perform. So I think that would be an area where the knowledge of women, the collective knowledge of women, can come in and improve and reconstruct the status of women after protests have reached hopefully a positive outcome. That's what I wanted to add. And in terms of this future, more interdependent feminist eco-society that the first question was talking about, I think for me it's very useful to think about gender as a description of labor relations. Basically, gender dictates a certain division of labor. And I think in order to combine struggles and to be more powerful, we have to overcome an essentialist view on gender. So we cannot go around and say, well, you aren't born a woman, but you become a woman. And then on the other hand, exclude people who are not, exclude, for example, our trans sisters from these struggles, because they too, as soon as they decide to live as women, they become subject, and they are impacted by the fact that gender is a description of a labor relation.
Thank you for those very practical and concrete interjections and examples. I think all of you have given such great concrete case studies, examples, and really a lot of information and food for thought for people to dig deeper into after this conversation. So I really want to say thank you for that. A final question for tonight from the audience. This question comes from Chia, and the question is to all three of you: what is your view on the potential of religion or spirituality or re-enchantment for feminist and social justice movements? What is your view on the potential of religion, spirituality, re-enchantment for feminist and social justice movements?
Well, I guess I'll perhaps begin. Is the last, yeah?
That's right, go for it.
So first of all, I wanted to add something to what Wahana said, in the 1970s in the United States, when before the abortion was legalized, there was, women were very skeptical on the feminists, on the capacity, our capacity to gain abortion. And so they created 130 underground clinic, self-help clinic, that where women basically began to do and learn to practice abortion. And that was an amazing feat. And then abortion was one. And so that network became then a network that began to be turned to teaching women about our own body. It became a kind of educational network instead of performing abortion, but to teach, for example, to use the speculum. Women knew nothing about menstruation, about menopause, about pregnancy, about orgasm, tremendous, ignorance about our bodies. And in fact, it produced a book, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which has been the most translated feminist book. And it has an enormous amount of, information, knowledge, reflection about religion and spirituality. Two very different things, I would say. And I think spirituality is very good, is necessary, it's part of the magic of life. It's, our desire, our relation with the natural world, with animals. Religion is an institution that historically has always been allied with power and continues to be allied with power. And today is particularly ominous in a way, because we have seen a major investment, beginning with the 1970s in the United States, by conservative parts of American capital who have investment in a whole, evangelical movement. Remember, the colonization came with the missionaries. Colonization was produced by the sword and the cross, right? The cross was always functional to the conquerors. It was another level of conquest. Religion was the way of conquering people in their everyday life, controlling their sexuality, controlling family relations. Religion really was the state coming into your home, into your family, into your reproduction. Anyway, we have seen a similar process, of multiplication across the world of Pentecostal evangelical sects who are basically propagating a very destructive brand of Christianity. They are saying, Jesus wants you to be rich. Wealth is good. It's a very neoliberal. But if you're poor, it's because there's something wrong with you, or because there are people in your community that are your enemies. And so it's not an accident that we have seen a revival of witch hunting. For example, in Africa, that has many causes, but one cause that all observers agree upon is the proliferation of this religious sect who keep talking about Satan, the demon, the witches in your community. And so, you know, I did a lot of work on the witch hunts of the 16th, 17th century. And so for me, the question of religion, the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th up to the 18th were not only religiously motivated, no, but the church and the state worked in unison. And now we see the same thing. We see that international capital has an investment, you know, in using all kinds of fundamentalism at a time when across the world, neoliberal policies are creating displacement, impoverishment, tension, social tension, right? To come, religion is having a new function of domination. So spirituality, yes, we need to recuperate the magic of the world. You know, magic, it's not, it's magia is knowledge. Magia, the word magic comes from a Greek word that means knowledge. It's a whole sensibility to the continuity of our life, you know, with nature, with animals and so on. That is different from from religion.
Thank you so much for that answer, Silvia. I wonder, Juana, Benedict, do either of you have anything to add to that point? Juana, please go ahead.
Yes, I agree with what Sylvia said, that organized religion is basically oppressive and is organized to be a tool for oppressors. But then I want to shift the focus a little bit towards spirituality. So basically what you might call in personal or your personal relationship with religion, rather outside the institutions of religion. And I'm thinking particularly of a struggle I'm particularly close to, and that is of the 24-hour care workers in Austria who work alone in old people's homes, taking care of them basically once they are demented and they can no longer live alone until they die. It's a very, very difficult work, both physically and emotionally, and they are very isolated in those jobs. They are also very exploited. And the shout out to my comrades on the ground in Vienna who are making excellent organizational work through their association, Drept pentru Îngrijire. But they tell me that spirituality really saves these women, really helps them go through those horrible moments when they are very isolated. They have no means they have no access to their own mental support, to somebody taking care of their mental health care. And so through their relationship with God or through whatever they believe in, they save themselves. Now, of course, within Christianity, there's a problem because the kind of we are in Romania, we're mostly Orthodox Christians, so there's a strong emphasis on self-sacrifice, especially for women. So on the one hand, it saves them individually at the level of mental health care, this spirituality, but then on the other hand, it might also put a stop in the way of their struggles and in the way of their awareness that they do have rights. They don't exist to sacrifice themselves. It's not their duty to sacrifice themselves as organized church might dictate. So there are two aspects to this, and we need to take both into account.
Thank you for that one.
Yeah, I would just want to add, one case to what, or one argument to what has already been said. To me, the difference between religion and spirituality is not always that clear. And I also know cases where you can really talk about religion, or where the activists would talk about religion. And although you could say it's an heretical religion, or it's and I'm thinking of these two activists in Iowa who have sabotaged the pipeline. And when you see with what courage they did it, so the Dakota pipeline that went through Iowa, the determination with which they did it, and when you actually hear them talk, it's very clear that they put themselves within a tradition of a specific tradition of Catholic social workers. And they said we had no choice. That is what we needed to do. The injustice was such, the devastation was such, that we were called upon. You could even say we were called upon by the dead, by the people who were there before us, to actually act. And so religion in that sense can also, if it's because it's almost a sub-branch of Catholicism here we're talking about, as a movement that really wants to bring religion into concrete action. But they really talk, you can go and have a look at it. It's the interview of the two Iowa who are now in prison, Iowa sabotageurs, if you like. And they talk a lot about religion. They talk a lot about the fact that the justice of men is not the justice they went for. The sense of justice they go for is a more just world. And a more just world, like they hear it, requires from them to sometimes go and sabotage the infrastructures that cause the devastation of this world. So for me, it's not all that clear cut. Perhaps then you would say, well, that's more a spiritual kind of religion. But to me, it's not all that clear. I was thinking of the same case where in the Mediterranean disaster that we're living in Europe, and where the Mediterranean Sea is becoming one huge, actually, tomb of so many people not getting across. Well, one of the first people who are actually going out there and acting out and doing civil disobedience were Protestant militants, Protestant activists. And it made me think that perhaps if you can quite easily put aside the justice of men and say there's something higher to me, there's something a bit more important to me, which is the sheer inhumanity of what I see here, the sheer devastation of what I see here. And I need to act because I'm not just me. I am a tradition. I am people. I am a community. I am what has gone before me. And religion, whatever you want, but they say they're Protestant, can also give that a higher sense of I'm doing it for the collective. So I think a lot can be gained from it, but it's a double-edged sword and it gives absolutely no guarantees. And the thing that I gain from it is that whether it's the dead of your community, whether it's the people that went before you, the people that go after you, whether it's a God, whether it's a sense that you are connected to a little bit more than your own ego and your own security. And I think once there is that, and it can come many ways, and I just want to emphasize that it can also come from perhaps heretical branches within religions that are, for the rest, quite massively power systems. So yes, I think there's a lot to be gained from it, just as there can be of the evangelical churches, I agree, have done more harm than anything else. But so I wouldn't put it against or for. It's just that there is a sense of overcoming. We shall overcome, and that you need to be carried by something else than just your own ego and your own security to actually go out and dare to do things that can actually put you in prison.
Thank you,
I'd like to add
Benedict.
something. I like to make a comment because it's true, but that's also spirituality in the sense, like the base community in Brazil, where they said the body of Christ is us. But that's different from, because the religions that we know, there is also a very undemocratic conception of the divinity. this absolute power. For example, the absolute power, you think I go to help somebody in the name of religion, but actually that somebody who is so powerful is the one who has made these people, drown or risk drowning. Is also the power, this very authoritarian conception of the divinity, also very much part of religion. And the cases that you're talking about is a cases of solidarity with other people, of understanding that there are forces in the world that go beyond ourselves and they take us beyond. Is when I was discussing before the power of memory, connecting with the struggle with others, the power of love. Love is a tremendous, people are ready to die for love. But again, if we speak of religion as a sort of spiritual power, but in terms of the actual realized, historically realized religions, there's something that, in addition to the institution, the conception itself of this all governing, this big man in the sky, right, that you have, that knows everything, decides everything, and people say, oh, God save me, right? You have a fire and you escape and say, God save me. But what about those who burned, right? So it's that conception of religion that I think many feminists have also spoken. I mean, that we need to free ourselves from.
Indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much to all of you for the complexification of that last question. I really appreciate the nuance that you've added to that. And I want to, as we round up, I want to thank you all for giving your time this evening, Benedict, Juana, Silvia, to add to such a rich discussion and give so much food for thought, so generous in your offerings for people to take away from this conversation. So many different access points and trajectories that people can go on and can take from this conversation. So I want to give you a hearty and heartfelt thank you for that generosity. Before we close, I would like to honor the contribution of the artist Jess Jones, who was a central figure and central instigator in the collaboration with Silvia Federici through her exhibition with Kunsthal Gent entitled Syllabus. And tomorrow there will be an online workshop with Jess Jones and Silvia Federici, where they have invited scholars, artists, and activists in Belgium with an interest in feminism, anti-racism, and/or agroecology for an evening of joyful militancy on how we can collectively re-enchant the world and reimagine and rebuild communal infrastructures of life and social reproduction. Via shared reading session, a digital dinner during which food stories are shared, an extensive contribution by Silvia Federici, they aim to build a toolkit in relation to the urgent questions of this moment of global crisis and opportunities for new common living environment. That online workshop is sold out, but it's just to give a nod to Jess Jones for being such a central figure in instigating the moment that we're sharing tonight. I want to send a huge, huge thank you so much to everyone who has contributed to this conversation and the re-enchantment of the world. A huge thank you to our partners at the University of Ghent and to our marvelous speakers for their insight and generosity. To everyone watching from wherever you may be, I want to give a hearty, heartfelt thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you soon in the new world. Goodbye.
Thank you to you. Hey, thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye. Thank you to